The notification on my phone felt like a ghost from the past. A name I hadn't seen in years suddenly appearing on my screen, bringing back a flood of memories I'd carefully packed away. "Mackenzie, it's Mom. We saw your feature in Business Insider. We're so proud. Can we meet? We miss you terribly." Miss me? That's a strange sentiment coming from the same woman who stood silently by as my father changed the locks on our family home when I was barely 18. Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, I'm Mackenzie Rivera, and today I'm finally sharing the story behind how I went from sleeping in my car to running a 7-figure business. Before we jump back in, tell me where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. December in Seattle is unforgiving. The rain doesn't just fall, it seeps into your bones, especially when you're 18, and the only shelter you have is a 2005 Honda Civic handed down from your grandmother. The car heater worked sporadically, at best, and the windows fogged constantly. But that steamed-up barrier between me and the world outside became my sanctuary. You will go to Washington State and major in education like we planned, or you will not be supported under this roof. My father's words weren't just an ultimatum. They were the culmination of years of trying to fold myself smaller and smaller to fit into the box they'd constructed for me. The daughter they wanted, obedient, traditional, predictable, was a costume that had grown too tight, and I was finally brave enough, or perhaps desperate enough, to remove it. I had been accepted to a prestigious digital marketing program in New York. A full scholarship based on the social media campaigns I'd built for local businesses, a portfolio I'd created in secret because wasting time on the internet wasn't acceptable in the Rivera household. Teaching was the respectable career my parents had chosen for me. Stable, appropriate for a woman who would eventually prioritize family anyway. The acceptance letter had sat hidden in my underwear drawer for weeks while I gathered courage. When I finally showed them, I expected disappointment, perhaps anger. I didn't expect my father to rip it up while my mother watched, arms crossed, lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. "This isn't a discussion," he said. "Your tuition is paid for WSU. You'll thank us when you're older and have a reliable career instead of chasing internet fantasies." That night, I made a decision that would alter the course of my life. I packed what I could fit in my Civic, clothes, my laptop, the emergency cash I'd been saving from odd jobs, and a small box of family photos that felt important even in my anger. The next morning, I left a note on the kitchen counter. "I have to follow my own path. I'll be okay." It was more reassurance than they deserved, but some small part of me still wanted to be the good daughter. I heard the locks being changed from the street where I'd parked to gather my thoughts. The definitive click echoed through the December air. My mother stood at the window, watching, making no move to stop my father. Her silence was its own kind of disownment. The first night in my car, parked behind a 24-hour diner where I'd convinced the night manager to let me use their restroom in exchange for helping with their social media, I cried until my body ached. Not because I was afraid, though I was, but because the reality of being truly alone struck me with unexpected force. I had $340 to my name, a quarter tank of gas, and a scholarship that wouldn't begin for another 3 months. New York may as well have been on another planet. That night, as rain drummed against the roof of my car, I made a promise to myself. I would never again be in a position where someone else could determine my worth or control my future. Whatever it took, I would build something that was undeniably mine. Morning came with a peculiar clarity. I opened my laptop, connected to the diner's Wi-Fi, and emailed the program director in New York explaining my situation and asking if there were any resources for students arriving early. Then I created a profile on a freelancing platform, offering social media management services at rates so low they were almost embarrassing. By noon, I had a response from the school. They couldn't offer housing until the term began, but they connected me with an alumni network that might help. By evening, I had my first freelance client, a small candle shop looking to establish an Instagram presence. The owner, Jade, was a woman in her 50s who had started her business after a divorce left her starting over at 40. When she heard my situation, she offered me her couch for a week while I figured things out. That week turned into 2, then a month, as I helped transform her social media, and she introduced me to other small business owners who needed similar help. "You've got a gift for this," she told me one evening as we reviewed the analytics showing a 200% increase in her online engagement. "You make people want to be part of a story." I didn't realize then that I was writing the first chapter of my own. By February, I had enough clients to rent a tiny studio apartment, more of a converted storage space above a bookstore, with a hot plate instead of a kitchen and a shower that never fully heated up. But it was mine, paid for with money I earned, doing work I loved. The freedom of that first space, despite its limitations, was intoxicating. I deferred my scholarship for a year. The program understood, even encouraged me to build my client base. "Real-world experience is invaluable," the director said. "You'll bring more to the program when you come." But as my client list grew, as local businesses began seeing real results from my strategies, the idea of putting my growing business on hold for school seemed increasingly counterintuitive. I was learning more from doing than I ever could from classes about doing. The breaking point came in August, when a regional restaurant chain hired me to overhaul their digital presence. The contract was worth more than my entire year's tuition. They didn't care about my degrees or credentials. They cared about results, and I had a growing portfolio of those. I called the program director and formally declined my place. It was terrifying. That scholarship had been my safety net, my validation that I wasn't just another delusional teenager chasing internet fame. But sometimes the bravest decision is to let go of the backup plan. By the 1-year anniversary of the night my parents changed the locks, I had 6 consistent clients, had hired my first assistant, another young woman whose parents thought social media was just a phase, and moved into an actual apartment with a real kitchen and a shower that worked properly. I sent my parents a holiday card with my new address and business card enclosed. No note, no explanation. Just proof that I was alive and thriving. The card was returned unopened, marked addressee unknown. They had moved without telling me. That rejection should have hurt, but instead it felt like freedom. The last thread connecting me to their expectations had been severed. I was entirely my own person now. The next 3 years passed in a blur of growth, both personal and professional. My client base expanded beyond Seattle. I hired more staff, developed proprietary analytics tools that could predict consumer engagement with remarkable accuracy, and eventually rebranded from Mackenzie's Media Management to Narrative Pulse, a full-service digital marketing agency specializing in authentic storytelling for brands. By 23, I was running a company valued at $2 million, with 15 employees and an office overlooking the same streets where I'd once slept in my car. My team didn't know that part of my story. To them, I was just the unusually young founder with a knack for understanding what made stories resonate. The Business Insider feature changed that. From homeless to powerhouse, how Mackenzie Rivera built a multi-million-dollar agency before 25. Wasn't the headline I would have chosen, but the journalist had been persistent, digging into my background, finding former classmates who remembered my abrupt disappearance from high school, connecting dots I'd carefully kept separate. I agreed to the interview partly to control the narrative, partly because hiding felt too much like shame, and I refused to be ashamed of surviving. The article was fair, even flattering, highlighting my journey without sensationalizing it. Though part about my parents was brief but clear. They had chosen tradition over supporting their daughter's dreams, and that choice had cost them a relationship with the successful woman I'd become. The article went viral within hours. My inbox flooded with messages. From potential clients, yes, but also from young people in similar situations, seeking advice, inspiration, validation, that walking away from toxic expectations wasn't selfish, but necessary. I answered as many as I could, established a scholarship fund for young entrepreneurs without family support, and tried to adjust to this new dimension of visibility. Being known was different from being successful. It felt more vulnerable somehow. Then came the text from my mother. 5 years of silence broken by a few carefully crafted sentences that managed to both claim pride in my accomplishments and completely sidestep their role in making those accomplishments so difficult to achieve. No acknowledgement of the locks. Being changed, the scholarship they tried to force on me, the returned holiday card. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Just, "We miss you," as though I'd been away on an extended vacation rather than explicitly rejected. I didn't respond immediately. I showed the message to my therapist, because yes, building a business while processing abandonment issues requires professional support, who asked the question that stopped me cold. What do you want from this reconnection, if anything? The truth was, I didn't know. Part of me wanted to ignore the message, to give them the same silence they'd given me. Another part wanted to respond with years of accumulated anger. And a small, persistent part, the part that had kept those family photos, wondered if people could change, if relationships could be rebuilt on new foundations. I sat with that question for 3 days before responding with a simple, "I'm available for coffee next Thursday at 2, Verdant Cafe on 5th. No pleasantries, no questions, just an opportunity for them to show up. Or not. They showed up. 15 minutes early, in fact. I watched them from across the street, noting how my father's hair had grayed significantly, how my mother seemed smaller somehow. They sat nervously, my father checking his watch repeatedly, my mother rearranging the sugar packets with obsessive precision. I almost walked away. The power of that choice, to walk away as they had done, was tempting. But I had promised myself years ago that I would never make decisions from a place of fear or petty revenge. So I crossed the street, took a deep breath, and opened the door to my past. Mackenzie. My mother stood, arms half extended for a hug I wasn't ready to give. I nodded politely and sat across from them, ordering a black coffee from the hovering waitress. "You look well," my father said, a master of understatement. I was more than well. I was successful, confident, dressed in clothes worth more than that Honda Civic had been. "Thank you," I replied, the polite response ingrained despite everything. "You've gone gray." He touched his hair self-consciously. Time passes. Indeed. It had 1,825 days since they changed the locks. Not that I was counting. "We saw the article," my mother began, her voice soft. "We had no idea that you'd been homeless." She stumbled over the word. "I lived in my car for a while," I corrected. "There's a difference." "We thought you'd gone to New York," my father interjected. "When you didn't come back, we assumed you were at that program." "You didn't check," I noted. "You didn't call the school. You didn't look for me." The silence that followed contained 5 years of absence. "We were angry," my mother finally admitted. "We thought you were being rebellious, that you'd come back when you realized how difficult it would be on your own." "And when I didn't?" My father shifted uncomfortably. "Pride is a powerful thing, Mackenzie. It can make people hold positions long after they know they're wrong." It wasn't quite an apology, but it was the closest I'd ever heard him come to admitting a mistake. My mother reached across the table, stopping just short of touching my hand. "We've missed so much of your life," she said, and I could see tears forming. "Your business, your success, we should have been there." I took a sip of my coffee, using the moment to collect my thoughts. "Yes, you should have been, but you chose not to be." "We'd like to be part of your life now," my father said, "if you'll let us." There it was, the opening I'd both hoped for and dreaded. The chance to either maintain the wall between us or begin the complicated process of building something new. "I'm not the daughter you wanted me to be," I said finally. "I won't pretend to be her for your comfort." "We know that," my mother replied. "We've seen what you've built. It's extraordinary." Would you be here if I'd failed? If that article had been about how I was struggling to make ends meet after rejecting your plans for me? The question hung between us, uncomfortable but necessary. My father's gaze dropped to his coffee cup. "I don't know," he admitted, and in that honest uncertainty, I found a strange respect for him. I'd like to think we would have, but I don't know. My mother reached into her purse and pulled out a small, worn envelope. "This came back to us," she said, sliding it across the table. The holiday card I'd sent years ago, marked "Addressee Unknown." "We'd already moved," she explained. "Your father's company transferred him to Portland." "We didn't think to." She trailed off, the implication clear. They hadn't thought to tell me because they hadn't expected to hear from me. "We kept it," she continued. "I don't know why. Hope, maybe." I picked up the envelope, feeling the weight of what it represented, an attempt at connection that had failed, a message lost in transition. Much like our relationship. "I can't just forget the last 5 years," I said carefully. "I can't pretend that night didn't happen, or that it didn't change me fundamentally." "We're not asking you to forget," my father replied, surprising me. "We're asking for a chance to know who you've become, to be part of who you're becoming." I studied them, these familiar strangers who shared my blood but didn't know my journey. The parents who had both shaped me and forced me to reshape myself in their absence. "I have a board meeting in 30 minutes, I said, glancing at my watch. "But I'm free next Thursday. Same time." It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. It was a door left slightly ajar, not for the relationship we had lost, but for whatever new one we might carefully construct from the ruins. That second meeting with my parents never happened, at least not as planned. The morning of our scheduled coffee, my phone rang with a Portland area code I didn't recognize. It was my father, his voice tense and clipped. "Your mother's in the hospital. Heart attack. Providence Portland Medical Center." Before I could process the information, he hung up. No details, no emotional context, just facts delivered with military precision. So typical of him even in crisis. I canceled my meetings and booked the first flight south. The irony wasn't lost on me. 5 years of silence, and now I was dropping everything because they needed me. Part of me resented the automatic response, the ingrained sense of obligation. Another part recognized that whatever happened next would shape my relationship with my parents permanently. The hospital smelled like all hospitals, antiseptic and anxiety, poorly masked by artificial fresheners. I found my father in the cardiac waiting room, a styrofoam cup of untouched coffee cooling between his hands. He looked older than he had a week ago, as though the intervening days had aged him a decade. "How is she?" I asked, keeping my distance, unsure of the protocols for this strange new territory between estrangement and reconciliation. "Stable." He stared at the coffee, not meeting my eyes. "Mild heart attack. They're keeping her for observation, running tests." "What happened?" He exhaled slowly. "We were arguing about you, actually." The admission hung between us, complicated and heavy. I sat across from him, maintaining the careful space. "About meeting me again?" He nodded. "She wanted to tell you everything. I thought, I thought we should be more careful. Not overwhelm you with," he gestured vaguely, "family history." "Family history," I repeated, sensing there was more beneath those two simple words. "When you left," he began, then corrected himself. "When we forced you out, your mother started having panic attacks. She'd wake up in the middle of the night convinced something terrible had happened to you. She'd drive around the city looking for your car." This was news to me. In my mind, they had simply moved on, relieved to be unburdened of their disappointing daughter. I didn't know. "You weren't supposed to." He finally looked up. "I told her it would only make things worse if you felt guilty, that you'd made your choice and we had to respect it." "You didn't respect my choice," I pointed out. "You punished me for it." He nodded, the movement almost imperceptible. "Yes." The simple acknowledgement, without justification or defense, struck me silent. "Your mother wanted to reach out many times. After the first year. After we saw your business card in Jade Wilson's candle shop when we visited Seattle. After a client mentioned hiring your company. I always convinced her not to. Why?" The question came out sharper than I intended. Pride? Fear? Mostly fear. Of what? That you'd reject us. That you'd tell us exactly what we deserved to hear. That you didn't need us anymore. He looked down at his hands, rough with age spots I hadn't noticed before. That you'd succeeded not because of our guidance, but despite our absence. A nurse appeared in the doorway, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Rivera, your wife is awake. You can see her now." He stood, hesitating. "She'd want to see you too." I followed him down the corridor. This man who had shaped so much of who I was by both his presence and his absence. The man who had locked me out but kept my returned holiday card. Contradictions wrapped in a stiff posture and graying hair. My mother looked small against the hospital sheets, pale but alert. When she saw me, her eyes filled with tears. "Mackenzie, you came. Dad called." She nodded, glancing at my father with something like surprise. I didn't think he would. The monitors beeped steadily, measuring the physical manifestation of her emotions. I approached cautiously and took her hand. It felt both familiar and foreign, like a place once known now revisited after significant changes. "The doctor says I need to avoid stress," she said with a weak attempt at humor. Apparently arguing about past mistakes qualifies. "We don't have to talk about that now," I offered, but she shook her head. "No more delays, no more secrets." She squeezed my hand. "I've lived 5 years with the consequences of our actions that night. I'm not wasting whatever time I have left in half measures." The heart monitor betrayed her agitation, and my father stepped forward. "Diana, please." The doctor said. "The doctor doesn't know what it's like to lose your child by your own doing, Richard." Her voice was stronger now, almost fierce. "To live knowing you sacrificed your daughter for what? Appearances? Control? Our own narrow vision of what success should look like?" The monitor's beeping increased, and a nurse glanced in with concern. My mother waved her away impatiently. "I'm fine. Just having a long overdue conversation with my daughter." The nurse retreated, but I noticed she didn't go far, hovering just outside the door. "Maybe we should talk when you're stronger," I suggested. "I've been weak for too long," my mother replied. "Weak when I let your father change the locks. Weak when I didn't search for you when the school said you'd deferred. Weak when I let pride keep me from admitting we were wrong." She looked directly at me, her gaze unflinching despite her physical frailty. "I don't expect forgiveness, Mackenzie. I just need you to know that not a single day has passed when I haven't regretted what we did." My father moved to the window, his back to us, shoulders rigid. This display of emotion, this acknowledgement of fault, went against everything he believed about parental authority. "Dad?" I prompted, He turned slowly, his expression controlled, but his eyes revealing conflicting emotions. Your mother is more eloquent about these things. He cleared his throat. But she's right. We were wrong. I was wrong. For a man like my father, those 4 words, I was wrong, represented a seismic shift. The Richard Rivera I grew up with believed admitting error showed weakness. The man standing before me looked both diminished and somehow more human. When we saw that article, he continued, I realized something. You succeeded not to spite us, but because the determination we tried to control was finally directed where you wanted it. The same qualities we tried to shape toward our ends, your persistence, your vision, your willingness to work harder than anyone else, those were what built your company. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. You are your father's daughter, just not in the way I expected. The heart monitor's rhythm had steadied. My mother watched us, tears tracking silently down her cheeks. We don't deserve to be part of your life, she said softly. But we'd like to try to earn that place if you'll let us. Outside, rain streaked the hospital windows, turning Portland into a watercolor of grays and greens. I watched the droplets form patterns, buying time to process emotions I'd kept carefully compartmentalized for years. I'm not the same person. Who left? I finally said. And you're not the same parents. I don't know what that means for us moving forward, but I'm willing to find out. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was an opening, an acknowledgement that the future remained unwritten. The doctors kept my mother for 2 more days of observation. I extended my hotel reservation and adjusted my meetings to remote. Each day, I spent hours at the hospital, gradually rebuilding a bridge across 5 years of absence. We talked about safe topics at first, my company's growth, their life in Portland, mutual acquaintances who had kept loose tabs on both sides. Gradually, the conversations deepened. I learned my parents had separated briefly the year after I left, their unity, fractured by the weight of what they'd done. My father revealed he'd followed my business developments through industry publications, keeping a file labeled Imstar Ventures that tracked my company's growth. I told myself it was just professional interest, he admitted. But I printed every article, every mention. My mother shared that she'd driven to Seattle 3 times, parking outside my office building, never quite finding the courage to come inside. I watched you once, leaving for lunch with colleagues. You were laughing. You looked so confident, so at home in your life. I convinced myself you were better without our interference. By the time she was discharged, we had established a fragile framework for moving forward. No pretending the past hadn't happened, but no dwelling in it either. Small steps, careful boundaries, and explicit communication rather than loaded expectations. Back in Seattle, I found myself at a crossroads. The Business Insider article had created unexpected momentum for Narrative Pulse. Acquisition offers arrived from larger marketing conglomerates. Industry recognitions that had seemed distant goals suddenly appeared within reach. My team was excited, motivated by the validation and visibility, but something felt unresolved. The narrative of my success had always been defined, at least privately, by proving my parents wrong. Now that they had acknowledged they were wrong, now that they wanted to be part of my life again, what was driving me? I mentioned this to my therapist during our weekly session. It sounds like you're experiencing a purpose shift, she observed. When our motivations are reactive, proving someone wrong, escaping something painful, reaching our goals can sometimes create an identity vacuum. Who are you when you're not defined by opposition? The question lingered as I navigated both my expanding business and my tentatively reconnecting family. My parents called weekly, careful not to overstep but consistent in their presence. They mentioned wanting to visit Seattle when I was ready, never pushing but making the invitation clear. 3 months after my mother's heart attack, I invited them to the opening of Narrative Pulse's new headquarters, a renovated warehouse with soaring ceilings and collaborative spaces designed to foster the creativity our clients valued. It was a public event filled with industry contacts and clients, a safe environment for our first in-person meeting since the hospital. When they arrived, I was in the middle of a conversation with Jade, who had become both a friend and advisor over the years. She spotted them first, her expression giving them away before I turned. They looked nervous, out of place among the younger tech crowd. My mother had aged her outfit carefully, not too maternal, not trying too hard to look hip. My father wore a suit that had been stylish when I still lived at home. "I'll give you a moment," Jade said, squeezing my arm supportively. As she passed my parents, she nodded politely. "Mr. and Mrs. Rivera, nice to see you again." My mother looked surprised at being recognized. Jade smiled. "You have your daughter's eyes, and she has your laugh, though she might not know it." It was true. Despite everything, there were traces of them in me, genetic echoes that no estrangement could erase. The event continued around us as we stood in our small bubble of reunification. No dramatic embraces, no scenes for the assembled business associates to witness, just a measured greeting that acknowledged both our history and our tentative present. "This is impressive, Mackenzie," my father said, looking around at the space that represented the physical manifestation of what I'd built. "Thank you. Would you like a tour?" I guided them through the headquarters, introducing them simply as my parents to team members we encountered. No explanations, no qualifiers. They met my executive team, viewed our case study wall, saw the scholarship program I'd established for young entrepreneurs without family support, a direct result of my own experience. My mother paused at the display highlighting the scholarship. "Recipients, you've created something meaningful out of a painful experience," she said softly. "That takes a special kind of strength." "I had good examples of determination," I replied, surprising myself with the admission, "even when I disagreed with how you applied it." Later, at dinner in a quiet restaurant away from the crowd, my father asked the question I sensed had been weighing on him. "The article mentioned you lived in your car. For how long?" 6 weeks, I answered honestly. Then Jade offered her couch. He nodded, absorbing this. "And you never considered calling us? Even at your lowest point?" "I considered it every day for months," I admitted. "But calling would have meant surrendering to your terms. And that would have cost me something more important than comfort." "Your identity," my mother said, understanding in her eyes. "Yes." My father looked down at his plate. "When I changed the locks, I thought you'd be back within days. A hard lesson that would bring you back to the sensible path." He shook his head. "I didn't expect you to have more resolve than I did." "You taught me to stand my ground," I pointed out. "You just didn't expect me to use that lesson against you." A waiter refilled our water glasses, the momentary interruption, giving us all space to collect our thoughts. "What happens now?" my mother asked when we were alone again. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "We can't go back to before. Too much has happened. I'm not your little girl anymore, and I won't pretend to be." "We wouldn't want you to," my father said, surprising me. "The woman you've become is..." He searched for the right word. Formidable. Coming from him, it was the highest compliment he could offer. "But we can move forward," my mother added. "However slowly, on whatever terms you're comfortable with." I studied them, these people who had both wounded me deeply and shaped the core of who I'd become. The parents who had rejected me and who now sat across from me, humbled by the consequences of their actions. "I'd like to try," I said finally. "With boundaries, with honesty. No pretending the past didn't happen, but no letting it dictate our future either." And so began the careful reconstruction of a family, built not on obligation or appearances, but on the authentic recognition of who we actually were. My parents rented an apartment in Seattle for monthly weekend visits. I introduced them to my life in measured doses: my favorite coffee shop, my rowing club, eventually close friends. 6 months in, my father asked if he could consult on a financial structure for my company's expansion plans. No strings, he clarified. Just offering expertise if it's useful. Say no if that crosses a boundary. I considered refusing on principle, but that would have been the old pattern: reaction rather than response. Instead, I evaluated the offer on its merits. I'll have my CFO contact you. She makes all final decisions on financial matters, but another perspective could be valuable. He nodded, accepting the parameters. It was a small moment, but significant. He was learning to meet me as an adult, to respect my boundaries rather than test them. My mother found her place more easily, connecting with my team during her visits, offering perspective without attempting to control. She helped with the scholarship program, conducting interviews with the emotional intelligence that I sometimes lacked when business efficiency took precedence. A year after that first hospital visit, we'd established a new kind of family connection, not the close-knit unit they had envisioned, nor the complete separation I had accepted, but something uniquely ours. Respectful, cautious, gradually warming with accumulated positive experiences replacing painful history. Then came the offer that would test our newly established balance. Marston Media, one of the largest communication conglomerates in the country, wanted to acquire Narrative Pulse. The offer was substantial: life-changing money, resources beyond what I could build independently, global reach for the approaches we had pioneered. It also meant decisions about leadership, about where I would fit in the larger organization, about the future of the company I had built from nothing. I mentioned it to my parents during their monthly visit, not seeking advice so much as processing aloud. To my surprise, they didn't immediately offer opinions or guidance. "What are you thinking?" my mother asked instead. I explained the pros and cons, the opportunities and concerns, the way acquisition would transform both the business and my role within it. It would be easier in some ways, I admitted. The constant pressure of being solely responsible for payroll, for strategic direction, for everyone's livelihoods, that would shift. But I'd lose autonomy, the ability to pivot quickly, to maintain our company culture. My father listened intently, asking clarifying questions but offering no directives. Finally, he said something that showed how far we had come. "You built this from nothing when everyone, including us, said you couldn't. Whatever you decide, we trust your judgment. You've earned that trust many times over." The validation I had once desperately craved now felt like just one factor among many. Important, yes, but no longer the driving force behind my decisions. I had built a life guided by my own compass, and their recognition, while healing, didn't determine my direction. I declined the acquisition offer. Instead, I proposed a strategic partnership that maintained Narrative Pulse's independence while creating collaborative opportunities. It was a complex arrangement, requiring months of negotiation, but ultimately more aligned with my vision. When the deal was finalized, my team celebrated at our headquarters. My parents attended, no longer awkward outsiders, but not quite insiders either, occupying that unique space we had created together. As champagne flowed and my employees celebrated, I found myself standing between worlds: the company I had built, the family I was cautiously rebuilding, the independent identity that had emerged from the crucible of that rainy night when locks changed and paths diverged. My father approached, offering a glass of champagne. "Congratulations," he said simply. "Thank you." I accepted the glass, noting the symbolic weight of the moment. My father acknowledging my success on my terms, not his. You were right, you know, he added, his gaze on the celebrating team rather than me, making the admission easier somehow. About your path, about what you were capable of. I know, I replied, not from arrogance, but from the hard-won confidence of having proven it true. He smiled slightly at the response. Of course you do. You always did. He raised his glass, in a small toast, to knowing your own mind. Across the room, my mother was chatting with Jade, the two women who had bookended my journey. One who had rejected me at my most vulnerable, one who had offered shelter when I needed it most. The complexity of that visual struck me profoundly. Life rarely gives us clean narratives with clear heroes and villains. My parents had failed me terribly, yes, but they had also instilled the determination that helped me survive that failure. Jade had saved me with her generosity, but she wasn't perfect either, just someone who made a different choice at a critical moment. And I was neither just a victim of parental rejection, nor solely a self-made success story. I was the product of all of it. The pain and the triumph, the abandonment, and the community I built afterward. The doors that closed and the ones I pried, opened through sheer force of will. As I looked around at this moment of culmination, my team, my parents, my headquarters, my successful negotiation, I realized something profound. Success wasn't about proving my parents wrong. It wasn't about the bank account they now knew about. It wasn't even about building a thriving company. Success was creating a life where I could stand fully in my truth without needing either their approval or their rejection to define me. Where their presence or absence was no longer the central organizing principle of my identity. They might miss me now that they saw what I had built. But the greater victory was that I no longer needed them to. My parents kicked me out as a teen, now they miss me after seeing my bank account. Part 3. The acquisition deal with Marston Media changed everything, though not in the ways I initially expected. The strategic partnership allowed narrative. Pulse to maintain its independence while accessing resources that would have taken years to build independently. Our team doubled in size within 6 months. We opened satellite offices in Chicago and Austin. My role evolved from hands-on CEO to strategic visionary, a transition that was both liberating and disorienting. Through it all, my parents maintained their careful presence, neither pushing for more involvement nor retreating when challenges arose. The monthly visits became a strange constant in my otherwise rapidly changing life. Sometimes we discussed business, my father offering insights from his decades of experience that, stripped of their previous authoritarian delivery, proved unexpectedly valuable. Other times we simply shared meals, gradually filling in the 5-year gap in our lives with carefully edited highlights. It was during one of these dinners, nearly 18 months after our hospital reunion, that my mother mentioned selling their Portland home. We're thinking of making Seattle more permanent, she said, watching my reaction closely. Not to impose on your life, she added quickly. Just to be available, if you want that. The old Mackenzie would have seen this as an invasion, another attempt to control my carefully constructed independence. The woman I had become recognized it as the vulnerable gesture it was. They were uprooting their life to be near the daughter they had once expelled from theirs. There's a condo development in Queen Anne that might suit you, I said after a moment. Close enough for regular contact, but not in my immediate neighborhood. The relief in their expressions confirmed I had found the right balance. Acknowledgement without excessive enthusiasm, boundaries without rejection. 2 months later, they moved into a modest 2-bedroom condo with views of Puget Sound. I helped them unpack, a strange reversal of the moment I had packed my belongings under duress 7 years earlier. As we arranged furniture and hung artwork, I noticed something missing. "Where are the family photos?" I asked. The carefully curated display of Rivera achievement that had dominated their Connecticut home was conspicuously absent. My mother exchanged a glance with my father. "We thought we might start fresh," she explained. "New memories, rather than pretending the old ones tell an accurate story." It was a surprisingly insightful decision, an acknowledgement that the carefully constructed narrative of family perfection they had maintained had been more fiction than reality. Instead of the formal portraits and achievement-centered images of the past, they hung landscapes, abstract art, and left empty spaces that silently acknowledged what was missing could not be retroactively filled. As they settled into Seattle life, an unexpected dynamic emerged. While my father maintained an appropriate distance, consulting occasionally on business matters but never overstepping, my mother developed genuine relationships with members of my team. Her background in education, the career she had attempted to force on me, gave her insight into training and development challenges as narrative pulse expanded rapidly. "Your mother has a real gift for mentoring the junior staff," my operations director commented during a leadership meeting. "She's helped 3 of our newest content strategists find their footing faster than we expected." I found myself in the strange position of watching my mother contribute meaningfully to the company I had built in defiance of her expectations. More surprising was my lack of resentment about it. The woman volunteering 2 days a week in our professional development program was not the same woman who had stood silently by as my father changed the locks. Or perhaps she was. Perhaps the capacity for both cruelty and kindness had always existed within her, just as they existed within me. The true test of our fragile reconstruction came unexpectedly, nearly 2 years after our reconciliation began. I was in New York for a conference when I received a call from a Seattle number I didn't recognize. "Ms. Rivera, this is Northwest Hospital. We have Richard Rivera here. He's had a stroke." The next hours passed in a blur. Flight arrangements, medical updates by phone, the strange sense of déjà vu as I rushed to another hospital bedside. Unlike my mother's heart attack, my father's condition was serious, the prognosis uncertain. I found my mother in the neurology waiting room, aged a decade and a day. When she saw me, she crumpled, the carefully maintained composure giving way to raw fear. "They don't know if he'll—" She couldn't finish the sentence. I held her, this woman who had failed to protect me at my most vulnerable moment, who was now herself utterly vulnerable. The symmetry wasn't lost on me, but there was no satisfaction in it. Only the complicated reality of caring for someone who had hurt you deeply. My father survived, but the stroke left its mark. The right side of his body weakened, his speech slurred, his formidable mental acuity dimmed around the edges. The proud, controlling man who had demanded perfection was now dependent on others for basic needs. The rehabilitation process was grueling. I adjusted my schedule, working remotely 3 days a week to help my mother navigate the medical system, the insurance paperwork, the daily challenges of caring for someone suddenly disabled. My team stepped up admirably, proving the systems I had built could function without my constant presence, a test I hadn't anticipated but was grateful to pass. Watching my father struggle through speech therapy, his frustration evident as words eluded him, I confronted complicated emotions. Part of me, a part I wasn't proud of but acknowledged honestly, wondered if this was some cosmic balancing of accounts. If the man who had wielded words as weapons, whose verbal pronouncements had cut me off from my home, was now being punished by losing that very power. But a larger part recognized the universal vulnerability of human existence, that my father, for all his flaws and failures, was simply a man facing his mortality, as all of us eventually must. During one particularly difficult therapy session, he grew frustrated with his inability to complete a simple verbal exercise. As the therapist stepped out to give him a moment to compose himself, he looked at me with such naked despair that all historical grievances temporarily fell away. "You don't have to be perfect," I told him quietly. "You just have to keep trying." He stared at me, recognition flickering in his eyes. the echo of his own exacting standards now reflected back as compassion rather than judgment. Slowly, he nodded, a single tear tracking down his face. That moment marked a subtle but significant shift in our relationship. My father's illness stripped away pretense, forcing an authenticity we might never have achieved otherwise. As his physical recovery progressed, our conversations deepened beyond careful pleasantries into more substantial territory. 6 months into his rehabilitation, during an afternoon when I was helping him with his prescribed walking exercises, he broached the subject we had largely avoided. "I've been thinking," he said, his speech still labored but increasingly clear, "about that night." I didn't pretend to misunderstand. That night needed no qualification between us. "You don't need to—" "I do," he interrupted, "while I still can." We sat on a park bench, the Seattle spring unfurling around us in delicate blossoms and persistent green. My father stared at his hands, one strong, one weakened, resting on the walking cane he now relied upon. "I was afraid," he admitted, "not of your failure, of your success." I waited, giving him the time he needed to form the words that still came with difficulty. "If you succeeded on your own terms, it meant everything I believed, everything I built my life around, was wrong." He looked up, meeting my gaze directly. "And if I was wrong about that, what else might I have been wrong about? It was easier to force you to conform than to question my own foundations." The admission, delivered with painful honesty, illuminated so much of our family dynamic. My father's rigid expectations hadn't been about ensuring my success. They had been about validating his own choices, his own worldview. "When did you know?" I asked. "That you were wrong about me?" He smiled slightly, the right side of his mouth not quite keeping pace with the left. "The Wilson Candle Shop, 2 years after you left. I saw your marketing materials, asked the owner about them. She showed me the results, how her business had grown. She said you were the most innovative thinker she'd ever met." He paused, gathering strength. I was proud and devastated, both. The contradiction made perfect sense to me. The pride in his daughter's achievement warring with the realization that it invalidated his fundamental assumptions. "That's why you kept Mom from contacting me?" He nodded. "Selfish, couldn't face being wrong. Your success meant my failure." The simple articulation of this truth, one I had intuited but never heard confirmed, was strangely healing. Not because it excused what they had done, but because it contextualized it within the limits of human frailty rather than deliberate cruelty. "What changed?" I asked. "Why reach out after the article?" "The stroke," he said, surprising me. At my confused expression, he clarified, "Not this one. Mini stroke. Last year. Doctor didn't catch it. Small one." He tapped his temple. "Made me think. Time limited. Regrets too heavy." I hadn't known about the earlier stroke, a small medical event that had apparently triggered their reaching out after the business. Insider article. The knowledge that mortality, not merely recognition of my success, had prompted their reconnection attempt shifted my understanding of our ongoing reconciliation. "I'm not sorry you forced me out," I said honestly. "It was painful, but necessary. I wouldn't have built what I did if you'd continued supporting me on your terms." He absorbed this with surprising equanimity. "I know, not asking forgiveness, just understanding." He reached for my hand with his stronger one. "Proud of you, not because you proved me wrong, because you were right about yourself." The distinction mattered. He wasn't simply impressed by my bank account or business success, but by the self-knowledge that had guided my path. As my father's recovery plateaued, leaving him functional but permanently altered, we all adjusted to a new family configuration. My mother took on the role of primary caregiver, revealing strength and resilience I hadn't witnessed during my childhood. My father, his previous authoritarian certainty softened by physical vulnerability, became more thoughtful, more willing to listen rather than pronounce. And I found myself in the unexpected position of helping to care for the parents, who had once abandoned me, not from obligation, but from the complex compassion that can exist alongside unresolved hurt. 3 years after our reconciliation began, Narrative Pulse was featured in Fortune magazine, a profile highlighting not just our business success, but our company culture and commitment to supporting young entrepreneurs without traditional support systems. The photographer wanted a portrait of me in our headquarters, surrounded by evidence of what I'd built. "Would you mind if your parents joined for one of the shots?" she asked, having met them during the day-long photo session. There's something compelling about 3 generations of a family taking different paths to success. My instinct was to refuse, to keep my professional achievement separate from my complicated family history. But something stopped me. Perhaps the recognition that my story, in all its complexity, might offer something valuable to others navigating similar terrain. "One photo," I agreed, but not the main one. We gathered in front of the scholarship wall, my stoic father leaning slightly on his cane, my mother standing straight beside him, me positioned slightly apart but undeniably connected. The resulting image captured something true about our journey, the distance between us visible but bridgeable, the shared features evident despite the emotional chasm we had only partially crossed. When the magazine was published, that family photo appeared as a small inset to the main profile. The caption read, "Rivera with her parents, Richard and Diana, who initially opposed her entrepreneurial path, but now support the next generation of self-made success stories through narrative." Pulse's scholarship program. It was a simplified version of our complex history, but not inaccurate. My parents had indeed become advocates for the scholarship recipients, offering mentorship and support to young people whose families, like mine once had, failed to recognize their potential. The irony wasn't lost on any of us, that my parents now helped other young people navigate the very journey they had made so difficult for me. But perhaps that was the point, that people could evolve, could learn from their failures, could channel regret into something resembling redemption. 5 years after that first text message, "We miss you," my relationship with my parents had settled into something I never could have imagined during those cold nights in my car. Not the unconditional closeness some families enjoy, but not the complete estrangement I had accepted as permanent either. Something uniquely ours, built on painful history, but not defined by it. My father's health declined gradually over those years, each small stroke diminishing him further but never erasing the essential clarity he had gained through vulnerability. My mother found unexpected purpose in the scholarship program, eventually taking a formal role as mentorship coordinator. And I continued building Narrative Pulse, guided less by the need to prove my parents wrong and more by the genuine belief in the power of authentic storytelling. On the 7th anniversary of my leaving home, a date that had once been marked only in my private thoughts, I received separate messages from each of them. My mother's was straightforward. "Thinking of you today. Grateful for second chances." My father's, limited by his increasing difficulty with technology, but no less meaningful. "Proud, always." That evening, I visited them in their condo, bringing dinner and the easy companionship we had gradually developed. As we ate, I found myself studying them, these familiar strangers who had both wounded and shaped me, who had failed me terribly, but were trying, in their imperfect way, to make amends. "I've been thinking," I said as my mother cleared the plates, my father resting in his adapted chair, "about opening a foundation, something separate from Narrative Pulse but aligned with its values, focused on supporting young people who have to build success without family backing." My mother paused, dishes in hand. "What would you call it?" I hadn't planned to share this part, but in the spirit of our hard-won honesty, I did. The second, door foundation. My father's eyes questioned, and I explained. When one door closes, another opens. That's what people always say. But they don't tell you that you have to build that second door yourself. That it's harder, takes longer, requires more from you than walking through a door someone else opened. I looked at them directly. But what you build yourself, no one can take away from you. The reference to that night when locks changed and paths diverged wasn't lost on them. My mother's eyes shimmered with tears, but she nodded in understanding. "It's perfect," she said simply. The foundation launched 6 months later with an initial focus on housing security for young entrepreneurs, ensuring that no promising talent had to live in their car while building their future. My parents contributed the proceeds from selling their Portland home to the endowment, a gesture that acknowledged the past without attempting to erase it. At the launch event, a young woman approached me, 19, determined, with the same hungry look I recognized from my own mirror 7 years earlier. "Your story changed my life," she said. "My parents cut me off when I dropped out of pre-med to start my tech company. Knowing you survived that, built all this, it kept me going on the worst days." I introduced her to my mother, who was now experienced at guiding scholarship recipients through the practical challenges of building without a safety net. As they talked, I watched my father observing from his wheelchair. His physical presence diminished, but his awareness still acute. Later, he gestured me closer, his speech now limited to essential words carefully chosen. "Full circle," he said, nodding toward the young entrepreneur. "Not quite," I replied. "She won't have to do it alone." He nodded slowly, understanding the subtle rebuke and the hope it contained. Not a perfect circle, but a spiral, returning to similar circumstances but at a different level, with the wisdom gained from previous revolutions. 7 years after being kicked out, my relationship with my parents remained complicated, marked by genuine progress, but also by permanent changes that couldn't be undone. The trust broken that December night had been partially rebuilt, but differently structured. Not the blind faith of childhood, but the cautious investment of adults who had experienced both harm and healing at each other's hands. They did miss me, as that first text had claimed. But what they missed wasn't the compliant daughter they had tried to shape. They missed the connection that might have been possible had they recognized my autonomy sooner, the years that could not be reclaimed. And I had stopped defining myself in opposition to their expectations or in pursuit of their approval. My success wasn't about the bank account they now knew about, or the magazine features, or the industry recognition. It was about the woman I had become while building something lasting from nothing but determination and talent. Some days, when clients asked about my journey, I would share carefully edited versions of my story, focusing on the car, the struggle, the gradual building of narrative pulse into an industry leader. Other days, when scholarship recipients shared their own family estrangements, I offered the full, complicated truth that reconciliation was possible but not guaranteed, that healing didn't erase scars but could make them meaningful. My father's health continued its gradual decline, each small stroke taking something more: mobility, then speech, then recognition. My mother aged more rapidly than her years should have dictated, the strain of caregiving etching permanent lines around her eyes. And I continued building, not just the business or the foundation, but a life defined by my own metrics of success. A life that included my parents in a limited but meaningful capacity, that acknowledged our shared history without being imprisoned by it. The lock on that family home had been changed 7 years ago, forcing me onto a path I wouldn't have chosen, but ultimately couldn't regret. The key to understanding what happened after, the true transformation, wasn't that my parents now missed me after seeing my bank account. It was that I had built something so undeniably mine that their approval or disapproval had become secondary to my own evaluation of my worth. that I could allow them back into my life from a position of strength rather than need. That reconciliation came not from their recognition of my financial success, but from mutual recognition of our shared humanity. Flawed, resilient, capable of both terrible mistakes and genuine growth. 7 years after being kicked out, I wasn't just successful by conventional metrics. I was whole, not despite the fractures, but because I had mended them on my own terms, creating something stronger at the broken places. The 10th anniversary of launching Narrative Pulse coincided with another milestone, my 31st birthday. A decade of building, growing, evolving from that desperate teenager in a Honda Civic to the woman whose marketing strategies were now taught in business schools. To mark the occasion, my team organized a celebration at the Olympic Sculpture Park, an elegant evening with clients, partners, and the ever-expanding Narrative Pulse family. My parents attended, of course. My father in his wheelchair, more frail, but still present, his awareness flickering in and out like a candle in a draft. My mother beside him, her caregiver role now so integrated into her identity that they moved as a single unit, her hands automatically adjusting his blanket, offering water, anticipating needs before they were expressed. The event planner had arranged photos documenting the company's growth throughout the venue. Our first tiny office above the bookstore, the initial team of 3, the gradual expansion into the converted warehouse, the satellite offices, the awards. A visual timeline of professional achievement carefully curated to tell a story of steady progress. What wasn't visible was the parallel personal timeline. The nights spent sleeping in my car, the shower at the YWCA, the meals skipped to afford website hosting, the crushing loneliness of those early years. Those memories remained private, shared only with those who had earned the right to that vulnerability. As guests mingled among the sculptures, sipping champagne and sharing Narrative Pulse stories, I found myself drawn to a quiet corner of the park overlooking Elliott Bay. The sun was setting, painting the water in golds and violets, the distant mountains fading into shadow. A decade ago, I couldn't have imagined this moment. Not just the professional success, but the complex reconciliation, the way wounding and healing could coexist in the same relationship. Quite a view. Tyler, my oldest friend and now Narrative Pulse's creative director, joined me at the railing. He had been there from the beginning, not just of the company, but of my journey. His family's couch had been my first refuge after being kicked out. His unwavering belief that I would succeed had sustained me when my own faith faltered. "Quite a journey," I replied, clinking my glass against his. "Would you change any of it?" he asked, the question simple but loaded with complexity. I considered carefully. Would I erase the pain of that December night? The humiliation of showering in public facilities? The fear of not knowing where next month's rent would come from? "No," I said finally. "It all led here. Even the worst parts." Tyler nodded, understanding what I meant. Without the locks changing, I might never have found the strength I didn't know I possessed. Without the complete severance from the safety, I might have built a smaller life. Comfortable perhaps, but lacking the fierce independence that defined me now. "Your father's asking for you," he said after a moment. "Seems important." I found my parents near the scholarship wall, a permanent feature that had traveled from our headquarters for the event. It displayed photos and brief stories of the young entrepreneurs we supported, each one reminding me of some aspect of my own beginning. My father gestured weakly for me to come closer, his speech now so limited that most communication required significant effort. "Present," he managed, the single word emerging with effort. My mother reached into her purse and withdrew a small velvet box. "He's been planning this for months," she explained, handing it to me. "Insisted on waiting for tonight." I opened the box carefully. Inside lay a simple gold bracelet, elegant without being ostentatious. Engraved on the inside were the words, "You built the second door." The reference to the foundation name, to the philosophy that had guided my life since being forced onto my own path, brought unexpected tears. This wasn't an extravagant gesture to compensate for past wrongs. It was a simple acknowledgement of truth, offered without expectation of reciprocal emotion. "Thank you," I said, meeting my father's gaze directly. He nodded once, satisfaction evident in his eyes. Then, with tremendous effort, he added, "Proud, always." The evening continued around us, glasses clinking, conversations flowing, business relationships deepening into personal connections. Through it all, I was conscious of the weight of the bracelet on my wrist, not just its physical presence, but what it represented. The complicated journey from rejection to recognition, from abandonment to acceptance. Later, as the event wound down and guests departed, my assistant approached with an unexpected message. "There's a young woman who's been waiting to speak with you. Says she's been trying to reach you for weeks. Normally, I wouldn't interrupt, but she seems determined." Curious, I agreed to speak with her. She was waiting near the entrance, early 20s, dressed simply but professionally, clutching a portfolio with white-knuckled intensity I recognized from my own early pitch meetings. "Ms. Rivera," she began, her voice steady despite obvious nervousness. "I'm Jordan Taylor. I've been trying to contact you about a potential partnership." "I have a business development team that handles partnership inquiries," I began automatically, but she shook her head. "This isn't just business, it's personal." She took a breath. "My mother is Rebecca Wilson, Jade Wilson's daughter." The name struck like a physical blow. Jade, the candle shop owner who had offered her couch when I had nowhere else to go, who had introduced me to my first clients, who had believed in my vision when my own family didn't. "Jade," I said softly. "How is she?" Jordan's expression told me everything before she spoke. "She passed away 3 months ago. Cancer." The news settled heavily. Jade had been my first real supporter, the foundation upon which everything else had been built. That she was gone, that I hadn't known, hadn't been there, felt like a personal failure. "I'm so sorry," I said, meaning it deeply. "I lost touch with her years ago. I should have." Jordan shook her head. She understood. She followed. "Your career, you know, kept a file of articles. Showed everyone who came into the shop her first client, who made it big." She smiled slightly. "She was really proud of you." The echo of my father's words, proud, resonated strangely. Two people, so different in their impact on my life, both claiming pride in what I had accomplished. "What can I do?" I asked, genuine in my desire to honor Jade's memory. Jordan opened her portfolio, revealing business plans, marketing strategies, financial projections. "Mom left me the candle shop. It's been struggling since the pandemic. Online competition, changing, neighborhood. I have ideas to revitalize it, but I need help." I studied the materials, clearly researched, thoughtfully presented, showing genuine business acumen. This wasn't just a sentimental appeal. Jordan had a vision for evolving her mother's legacy while preserving its essence. "I'm not asking for charity," she clarified, perhaps misreading my expression. "I'm proposing a business arrangement, strategic guidance in exchange for a small equity stake. The shop has potential. It just needs updating." Her determination, her clear-eyed assessment of both challenges and opportunities reminded me powerfully of myself at her age. The difference was that she was trying to save something existing rather than build something new. But the fundamental quality of seeing possibility where others saw only problems was identical. "Come to my office tomorrow," I said, making a decision. Not for a partnership with Narrative Pulse, for something else. The next morning, I explained my idea to Jordan. The Second Door Foundation had primarily focused on housing security and educational support for young entrepreneurs. What if we expanded to include a business revitalization program? Small investments in struggling legacy businesses with strong community ties, but needed modernization to survive. Jade's Candle Shop could be our pilot, I suggested. A test case for whether we can help established businesses adapt without losing their identity. Jordan's expression shifted from hopeful to suspicious. Is this charity? Because I meant what I said. I want a business relationship, not pity. Not charity, I assured her. But not completely calculating either. Let's call it honoring a debt. Your mother gave me a chance when no one else would. This is simply extending that same opportunity to someone else who deserves it. We spent the morning outlining parameters for what would eventually become the Legacy Revitalization Initiative, a program designed to bridge the gap between established community businesses and modern market demands. By afternoon, we had a framework. By evening, preliminary budget allocations from the foundation. As Jordan left my office, plans in hand, she paused at the door. Mom always said, giving you that couch was the best business decision she ever made. I didn't understand until today. She smiled slightly. You really are exactly who she said you were. The encounter with Jordan, the reminder of where I had come from and how fragile life's connections could be, prompted reflection. That evening, I visited my parents at their condo, arriving unannounced with takeout from my father's favorite restaurant. My mother answered, surprise evident in her tired eyes. Caregiving had aged her prematurely, the strain of constant vigilance etched into permanent lines around her mouth and eyes. Mackenzie, we weren't expecting you until Sunday. Spontaneous dinner, I explained, holding up the bags. Is that okay? Of course. She stepped back, welcoming me into the space they had carefully designed to accommodate my father's increasing limitations. Wider doorways for the wheelchair, adaptive equipment discreetly integrated into stylish furnishings. My father was in the living room, gazing out at the water view. He turned when I entered, recognition dawning slowly but definitively. These days, his lucidity varied, sometimes sharp and present, other times drifting in a fog of neurological decline. Tonight, fortunately, he was clear-eyed, nodding and greeting as I unpacked the food onto the dining table. As we ate, I shared the story of Jordan and Jade, the new initiative, the strange circling back to where my journey began. My mother listened intently, asking thoughtful questions about implementation details. My father remained mostly silent, but I could tell he was following the conversation, processing in his slower but still deliberate way. It feels right, I concluded, using the foundation to support exactly the kind of small business that saved me when I needed it most. Full circle, my father said, one of his increasingly rare complete phrases. Not quite, I replied. More like a spiral, coming back to similar circumstances but with greater resources, different perspective. He nodded, pleased with the distinction. What do you need from us? My mother asked, pragmatic as always. It was a question that would have once raised my defenses, assuming I needed anything from them had been our fundamental conflict. But now I understood she was simply offering whatever support she could provide, no expectations attached. Nothing. Practical, I answered honestly. Just sharing the moment. The simplicity of that statement, the acknowledgement that I wanted to share significant moments with them without needing anything tangible, marked how far we had traveled from that night when need and rejection had defined our relationship. After dinner, as my mother cleared dishes despite my offers to help, my father gestured me closer. Story, he said, the word emerging with effort. Then, tell. Which story? I asked, unsure of his meaning. Yours, how you say it now. I understood then. He wanted to know how I narrated my own journey, not just the professional timeline, displayed at the anniversary celebration, but the personal one, including the painful chapter they had authored. It depends on who's asking, I said truthfully. The public version focuses on the entrepreneurial journey, the innovative approaches, the client successes, the growth strategies. The private version includes more detail about living in my car, about Jade's couch, about the fear and loneliness. He nodded, understanding the distinction between public and private narratives. Us? He asked simply. In story? It was a brave question, asking how I portrayed them in the narrative of my life. Did I cast them as villains, as obstacles overcome, as catalysts for eventual success? I say that my parents had a very specific vision of success, I answered carefully. That when I chose a different path, they couldn't support it. That being forced to succeed entirely on my own terms was painful, but ultimately formative. I paused, then added, in the most private version, I say that my parents failed me when I needed them most, but found their way back when they could offer something besides financial support. He absorbed this, his expression unreadable. Then, with tremendous effort, he formed a complete sentence. Fair assessment. The simple acknowledgement that my narrative of our shared history was reasonable, that I wasn't obligated to sugarcoat their actions or exaggerate their redemption, felt like a gift. Not forgiveness, which had been tacitly extended years ago, but permission to own my truth without qualifying it for their comfort. That night marked another subtle shift in our relationship. The careful dance of reconciliation had evolved from its initial tentative steps to something more authentic. Not perfect, not without lingering pain, but honest in its complexities. The Legacy Revitalization Initiative launched formally 3 months later, with Jade's Candle Shop as its first beneficiary. Jordan had embraced my suggestions for modernizing while preserving the core identity that had made her mother's business special. The shop now featured an expanded online presence, workshops for custom scent creation, and sustainable packaging options, all while maintaining the warm, personal atmosphere that had once welcomed a desperate teenager with nowhere else to go. At the initiative's launch event, held in the renovated candle shop, my father insisted on attending despite his declining health. The effort required was substantial: the wheelchair transfer to the specialized van, the careful navigation of unfamiliar spaces, the exhaustion of sustained social interaction. But he was determined, and my mother, ever his facilitator even in illness, made it happen. As I gave remarks about the program's vision, I found myself unexpectedly emotional. The shop had been restored beautifully, Jade's original vision enhanced, rather than replaced. The scent of beeswax and essential oils, the same comforting fragrance that had welcomed me to that life-changing couch, filled the air. This initiative honors the businesses that form the backbone of our communities, I explained to the assembled guests. Places that offer not just products or services, but human connection. The kind of connection that can save someone when they need it most. My gaze found my father in the audience, watching me intently from his wheelchair. In that moment, I recognized something I had missed in earlier years of our reconciliation. That his pride in me wasn't about claiming credit for my success or validating his parenting. It was simpler and more profound than that. He was proud of who I had become despite his failures, not because of his influence. After the formal presentation, as guests mingled and explored the renovated shop, Jordan approached with a small package wrapped in the store's signature paper. "Mom left this for you," she said quietly, "with instructions to give it to you if you ever came back into our lives. Seems like the right moment." I opened it carefully. Inside was a candle in a simple glass container. The label read, "Second." "Door," in Jade's distinctive handwriting. The scent was complex, notes of cedar and sage layered with something brighter, more hopeful. "She created it after reading about your foundation," Jordan explained. "Said it needed to smell like resilience." The thoughtfulness of the gesture, that Jade had recognized the significance of the foundation's name, had translated that meaning into something tangible, touched me deeply. That she had prepared this connection reaching beyond her death felt like closing a circle I hadn't realized remained open. I placed the candle beside my father's wheelchair, letting him experience the scent. "From Jade," I explained. "The woman who gave me her couch." He nodded, understanding the significance. Then, with the directness illness had paradoxically enhanced, he said, "She did. What we should have." The simple acknowledgement, unqualified without defensive caveats, was perhaps the most complete apology he could offer. Not just for failing to support me, but for failing to recognize what true support looked like. That evening, after seeing my parents' home and ensuring my father was comfortably settled, I had a quiet conversation with my mother on their balcony overlooking the water. "He's declining faster," she said, not needing to specify who. "The neurologist says maybe 6 months, maybe less." I absorbed this, the inevitable progression we had all recognized but avoided discussing directly. "What do you need from me?" "Nothing practical," she said, echoing my own words from months earlier. "Just presence, when you can." The simplicity of the request, asking for my time rather than specific actions, reflected how far we had come. The mother who had once stood silent as locks changed, now asked only for my company, as she navigated the final journey with the man whose actions had nearly destroyed our family. "I can do that," I assured her. We sat in companionable silence, watching ferries cross the darkening water. After a while, she spoke again, her voice thoughtful. "I've been thinking about that. Not to dwell on it, but to understand it better." She looked at me directly. "I told myself I was being a supportive wife by not contradicting your father, that the marriage needed to present a united front. But the truth is, I was a coward." The frank self-assessment surprised me. My mother had acknowledged her failure before, but never with such unvarnished clarity. "You were," I agreed, not unkindly. "But courage can be learned. You've shown that." She smiled slightly, appreciating the truth without sugarcoating. "Too late for some things, not for others." "That's how it works, I think," I replied. "We rarely get to fix what we broke. We just try to build something new beside the ruins." She considered this. "The second door." "Exactly." Over the following months, as my father's condition deteriorated according to the neurologist's prediction, I adjusted my schedule to be more present, not abandoning my responsibilities at Narrative Pulse or the Foundation, but delegating more, trusting the teams I had built to function without my constant oversight. The time with my father was rarely dramatic. No deathbed confessions or profound reconciliations beyond what we had already established. Mostly, it was simple presence, reading to him when his vision blurred, sitting together, watching baseball games he followed with varying comprehension, sometimes just being in the same room while he slept. One afternoon, during a period of unusual clarity, he asked me a question that revealed he had been thinking more deeply than his limited communication suggested. "Happy?" he asked simply. It was a reasonable question, but one that required consideration. Was I happy? The success of Narrative Pulse was undeniable. The Foundation was making meaningful impact. My relationship with my parents had evolved beyond what I could have imagined during those dark nights in my car. But happiness seemed too simple a metric for the complex life I had built. "Content," I answered finally. "Purposeful. Mostly at peace." He nodded, accepting this more nuanced response. Then, with effort, "Forgive." I knew what he was asking. Not whether I had forgiven them. We had moved beyond that question years ago. But whether I had forgiven myself. For the anger I had carried, for the years of rejecting reconciliation attempts, for the complicated emotions I still sometimes experienced when remembering that night. "Working on it," I said honestly. "Some days better than others." He seemed satisfied with this answer, recognizing the ongoing nature of emotional healing. After a moment, he added, "Me too." The simple exchange, acknowledging that forgiveness, both of others and oneself, was a process rather than an event, felt more authentic than any dramatic declaration could have. My father died 3 weeks later, slipping away quietly in his sleep while my mother dozed in the chair beside his bed. The end came not with dramatic revelations or 11th-hour reconciliations, but with the quiet dignity of a story that had already found its resolution. The funeral was small, attended primarily by my mother's friends and a few of my father's former colleagues. I gave a eulogy that acknowledged both the complicated history and the genuine growth of our later relationship. "My father was a man who believed in correct paths," I said to the assembled mourners. "For most of his life, he saw success as following established routes, making predictable choices, building security through conformity. When I chose differently, it created a breach that took years to heal." I paused, looking at the simple wooden casket adorned with white lilies. But the greatest testament to my father's character isn't found in the years when his certainty seemed unshakable. It's in what came after, his willingness to reconsider fundamental assumptions, to acknowledge when he had been wrong, to rebuild relationship on new foundations. He learned in his final years that the correct path isn't always the expected one, that sometimes the strongest buildings rise from the ruins of what came before. Afterward, as guests departed, a former colleague of my father's approached. "Richard was so proud of you," he said. "In those last years, whenever anyone asked about his daughter, he'd light up. Not just about your business success, though he certainly mentioned that, but about your resilience. She built something from nothing," he'd say, "all on her own terms." The observation echoed what I had come to understand, that my father's pride in me wasn't about claiming credit or validating his choices. It was about recognizing that I had succeeded not through adherence to his vision, but through commitment to my own. In the months following my father's death, my mother underwent her own transformation. Without the demands of caregiving, she discovered unexpected energy for new pursuits. She expanded her role at the foundation, developed a formal mentorship program for scholarship recipients, even took coding classes so she could better understand the technical aspects of the companies we supported. "I spent decades defining myself through your father's expectations," she explained when I expressed surprise at her late-life renaissance. "Then years defining myself as his caregiver. Now I'm just me, figuring out what that means." It was a journey I recognized intimately, the search for identity independent of others' definitions. For me, it had begun at 17 in a Honda Civic. For my mother, it started at 65 in an empty condo. Different circumstances, similar process. On the first anniversary of my father's death, my mother and I visited his grave together, placing stones rather than flowers in accordance with a tradition he had appreciated despite not being religious. "He would be pleased with where we are," she said, as we stood before the simple marker. "Not just your success or my activities, but this, that we found our way back to being family, however unconventionally." I nodded, acknowledging the truth of her observation. "On our own terms." "On our own terms," she echoed, slipping her hand into mine. We stood there quietly, 3 generations of a family's story contained in that moment. My grandparents' traditional values that had shaped my father, his rigid expectations that had both wounded and strengthened me, my determined forge of an independent path, and now my mother's late-life journey towards self-definition. As we walked back to the car, I thought about the narrative of my life, the story I told publicly, the one I shared privately, and the one I held in my own heart. The truth was, being kicked out had been both the most painful experience of my life and the catalyst for everything meaningful I had built. My relationship with my parents had contained both profound failure and genuine redemption. The simple narrative suggested by that viral headline My parents kicked me out as a teen. Now they miss me after seeing my bank account. Captured only the shallowest dimension of a much deeper story. Yes, they had rejected me and later sought reconnection after seeing evidence of my success. But the genuine reconciliation hadn't come from their recognition of my financial achievements. It had come from mutual acknowledgement of our shared humanity, flawed, resilient, capable of both terrible mistakes and genuine growth. 12 years after being kicked out, I had built not just a successful company and a meaningful foundation, but a life defined by my own metrics of value. A life that included my mother as a genuine partner in creating opportunity for others, that honored my father's belated recognition of my path's validity, that extended Jade's legacy of timely generosity. If there was a lesson in that journey, one worth sharing beyond the clickbait headline, it was this. The most valuable second doors aren't the ones others open for us. They're the ones we build ourselves, using whatever materials life provides, including the painful experiences that initially seem like dead ends. And sometimes, through that door, we find not just our own path forward, but a way to reach back and offer others the hand no one extended to us. 5 years after my father's passing, Narrative Pulse had evolved beyond anything I could have imagined when pitching my first nervous client. We now maintained offices in 7 cities, employed over 200 people, and had expanded our services to include immersive digital experiences using emerging technologies. The company had become an industry leader, referenced in marketing, textbooks, and business school case studies. My personal net worth had crossed into territory that still occasionally felt surreal, especially on nights when memories of showering at the YWCA surfaced unexpectedly. My mother, now 70, had created her own unexpected second chapter. What had begun as occasional mentoring at the foundation had evolved into a formal role heading the Legacy Revitalization Initiative. The program that had started with Jade's Candle Shop now supported dozens of community-rooted businesses across the Pacific Northwest, helping them modernize without losing their essential character. My mother brought to this work an intuitive understanding of tradition and innovation that perfectly matched the program's mission. "You've found your calling," I observed one evening as we reviewed applications for the next funding cycle. We were sitting in her office at Foundation headquarters, a space she had designed with warm colors and comfortable seating that put nervous applicants at ease. "At 70, she agreed with a slight smile. "Better late than never." "Like mother, like daughter," I pointed out. "Just different timelines." She paused, considering this parallel. "I wonder sometimes if I had recognized your path earlier, supported your vision instead of opposing it. Where would we be now?" It was a question without a clear answer. Would earlier support have accelerated my journey? Or would the comfort of a safety net have made me less determined, less innovative? The desperate circumstances of those early years had forced solutions I might never have discovered otherwise. "Different place, probably," I said finally. "Not necessarily better." She nodded, accepting this. The lock theory. It was a reference to a concept I had developed for a TED Talk the previous year. The idea that sometimes being locked out of expected paths forces the creation of entirely new ones. The talk had gone viral, resonating with anyone who had faced rejection on their journey to success. "The foundation is looking to expand the scholarship program," I mentioned, changing the subject. "We're thinking of creating a special category for students rejected from family support systems. The Mackenzie Rivera Scholars," my mother suggested. I shook my head. I was thinking the Diana Rivera Mentorship Initiative, for parents learning to support unconventional paths. The suggestion clearly caught her off guard. "You want to name something after me? After what we did?" "Because of what you've done since," I clarified. "The journey from who you were to who you've become." That's a powerful example for other parents struggling to understand children whose dreams don't match their expectations. She blinked rapidly, emotion evident. I don't deserve that. It's not about deserving, I replied. It's about meaning. Your transformation means something to people facing similar crossroads. We left the conversation there, neither confirming nor rejecting the naming idea, but the suggestion had touched something important. Acknowledgement that my mother's growth wasn't erased by her earlier failures. That redemption, while never complete, was still valuable. The following week brought an unexpected opportunity. Harvard Business School invited me to give a guest lecture on narrative marketing in the digital age. The invitation itself wasn't unusual. I had become a regular speaker at prestigious institutions. But the timing coincided with a rare trip east, the first time I would be near Ridgefield since leaving at 17. After confirming the Harvard engagement, I found myself contemplating a detour. Ridgefield, the site of both my formative years and my ultimate rejection. The town I had fled in a borrowed car with everything I owned stuffed in the back seat. I hadn't set foot there in 15 years. Are you sure this is a good idea? Tyler asked when I mentioned my plans during our weekly strategy meeting. He knew better than most the complex emotions surrounding my hometown. No, I admitted, but I think it's a necessary one. I didn't announce my visit to anyone in Ridgefield. This wasn't about reconnecting with old acquaintances or showing off success to those who had doubted me. It was a private pilgrimage to places that existed now more in memory than reality. After the Harvard lecture, I rented a car and drove. The 2 hours to Connecticut, arriving as evening settled over the familiar landscape. Though I had anticipated emotional turbulence, the initial sensation was milder, a strange doubling of vision, past and present overlaying each other as I navigated streets simultaneously foreign and intimately known. I drove past my old high school, now sporting a modern addition and electronic signage, past the park where I had spent countless hours reading under the oak trees, past the coffee shop where I had worked summers during school, now transformed into a trendy bistro. Eventually, I found myself on my old street, slowing as I approached the house where I had grown up. I had prepared for this moment, or thought I had. But seeing the physical structure, different exterior paint, mature landscaping where saplings had once stood, a basketball hoop where there had been none, produced an unexpected wave of emotion. This building, this ordinary suburban home, had been the site of both nurturing and wounding. Within these walls, I had been both the beloved daughter and the rejected disappointment. The family who had lived here, my family, had been simultaneously the force that shaped me and the obstacle I had to overcome. I parked across the street, observing without approaching. New owners occupied the space now, evident from the children's bicycles in the driveway, the holiday decorations adorning the porch. Their story had replaced ours, the walls now witnessing different dynamics, different dreams, perhaps different conflicts. As I sat watching dusk gather around my childhood home, a memory surfaced, not of the final confrontation, but of an earlier moment. I was perhaps 12, presenting my father with a school project on digital communication trends. Despite his traditional outlook, he had listened attentively, asking questions that showed genuine interest in my perspective. "You see things differently," he had said, not as criticism, but with something like wonder. The complexity of that memory, evidence that our relationship had contained genuine connection before hardening into opposition, brought unexpected tears. The narrative of complete rejection had been simpler, cleaner. The truth, as always, contained more nuance. I wrote a note on my business card. The former occupant made a brief pilgrimage, wishing your family joy in this home, and slipped it into the mailbox. Not looking for connection, just acknowledging the transition of spaces from one life story to another. My next stop was less planned, almost a gravitational pull toward Maple Street, where Jade's sister Alice had lived. Alice's couch had been my refuge for those 2 weeks before I left for Providence. Last I had heard, she had moved to Florida, years ago. But I found myself drawn to the sight of that first kindness after rejection. The modest duplex looked much the same, though the blue shutters had been replaced with black ones. As I slowed, the front door opened, and an elderly woman emerged onto the porch, eyeing my car with the wariness of someone unaccustomed to strangers lingering. I rolled down my window. "I'm sorry to disturb you. I was just visiting. I used to know someone who lived here." She approached cautiously. "Alice Wilson?" The name sent a jolt through me. "Yes, you know her?" "I'm her mother. I moved in after she went south." She studied me more carefully. "You look familiar, though it's been years." "Mackenzie Rivera," I supplied. "I stayed with Alice briefly when I was 17. Recognition dawned slowly. "The girl who slept on her couch, before heading to Rhode Island." "That's me." She nodded, her expression softening. "Alice mentioned you'd done well for yourself. Saw something about you in a magazine." The casual confirmation that I had remained in their awareness over the years touched something deep. "Is Alice well?" "Living her best life in Tampa. Retired early from teaching, volunteers with foster kids now." She glanced back at the house. "Would you like to come in for tea?" I don't get many visitors who remember Alice from her Connecticut days. The invitation was unexpected, but welcome. I accepted, following her into the familiar living room, now furnished differently, but with the same fundamental layout. The couch, where I had spent those pivotal nights, had been replaced with a floral love seat, but stood in the same position. "My name's Elaine," she offered, putting on a kettle. "Alice would be tickled to know you stopped by." Over tea and mismatched cups, Elaine shared updates on her daughter's life, her early retirement after 30 years of teaching, her advocacy work with teenagers aging out of foster care, her recent marriage to a woman she had met volunteering. "She always had a soft spot for young people making their own way," Elaine commented. "Said letting you stay those weeks was one of her better decisions, especially after hearing how things turned out." The validation that the help offered had been valued not just by the recipient, but by the giver, felt like closing a circle. I shared my recent connection with Jade's daughter, the Legacy Revitalization Initiative, the way that early kindness had rippled forward. "That's how it should work," Elaine observed. "Kindness moving forward, multiplying." She studied me over her teacup. "Your parents? Did they ever come around?" The question was direct but not unkind. I gave her the complex truth rather than the simplified narrative. "Eventually. Not perfectly, but meaningfully. My father passed 5 years ago. My mother runs a foundation program supporting young entrepreneurs now." "Full circle," Elaine nodded. "Or some version of it." When I left an hour later, having exchanged contact information and promised to connect her with Alice, I felt a sense of completion I hadn't anticipated. The visit hadn't dramatically changed my understanding of my journey, but it had added texture, nuance, connection between disparate chapters. I spent that night in a hotel near Ridgefield, contemplating my impromptu pilgrimage. The town held less power over me than I had feared. Time and distance had transformed what once felt like categorical rejection into something more contextualized, one chapter in a longer story, influential but not definitive. The next morning, before heading to the airport, I made one final stop, the cemetery where my father was buried. I had missed his funeral, committed to an international client engagement that couldn't be rescheduled. My mother had understood, had even suggested he would have appreciated prioritizing professional obligations. But I had never visited his grave, never had that moment of physical connection to his absence. The cemetery was quiet in the early morning, mist hanging between the trees, dampening sound. I followed the plot information my mother had provided, eventually finding the simple marker, Richard Rivera, beloved husband and father, the journey continues. The epitaph surprised me. An acknowledgement of continuity rather than ending, of evolution rather than stasis. It seemed to capture something essential about how my father had changed in those final years. His rigid certainties softened into more nuanced understanding. I placed a small stone on the marker, following the tradition he had respected. Not flowers that would fade, but something enduring, something that acknowledged permanence amid change. "We figured it out eventually," I said softly. "Not perfectly, but enough." The return flight to Seattle felt like transition between worlds. The past I had revisited, and the future I continued building. I used the hours to draft new parameters for the Diana Rivera Mentorship Initiative, focusing on supporting parents learning to validate unconventional paths. By the time we landed, I had a framework ready to present to the foundation board. My mother was waiting at baggage claim, a surprise since I hadn't told her my exact arrival time. She must have tracked the flight. "How was the Harvard lecture?" she asked as we embraced. "Successful," I replied. But that wasn't the significant part of the trip. In the car heading home, I shared the details of my Ridgefield pilgrimage. The house, the meeting with Elaine, the cemetery visit. My mother listened intently, asking occasional questions, but mostly absorbing. "I wish I could have been there with you," she said finally. "But perhaps you needed to do this alone." "I did," I agreed. "But I'm ready to talk about the Diana Rivera Initiative now." Her expression registered surprise, then cautious interest. "You were serious about that?" "Completely. Your journey from where you were to where you are now. That's a valuable template for other parents struggling to understand different paths." "My journey included terrible mistakes," she reminded me. "Yes," I acknowledged. "That's what makes it authentic. Perfect parents don't need guidance. It's the ones who've made mistakes, recognized them, and found ways forward who have something valuable to share." She considered this, then nodded slowly. "On one condition. We develop it together, your perspective alongside mine. The full circle. Deal." The initiative launched 6 months later with a dual focus, supporting young people charting unconventional paths and providing resources for parents learning to validate dreams different from their expectations. The program materials included both our stories, not as a simplistic redemption narrative, but as honest reflection on harm, healing, and the complicated journey toward reconciliation. At the launch event, held at Foundation headquarters, I watched my mother address the gathered supporters, donors, and first cohort of participants. At 70, she had developed a quiet confidence I had never witnessed during my childhood. An authenticity that came from having faced her worst failures and found a way to create meaning from them. "The most painful moments in our family history cannot be erased," she told the audience. "The night we changed the locks and forced our daughter out, that happened. The years of separation, those are real. The harm done cannot be undone." She paused, meeting my gaze across the room. "But what can change is what happens next. The meaning we create from our failures, the growth we choose despite our worst moments. The connections we rebuild, not identical to what was lost, but perhaps stronger in their acknowledgement of both brokenness and resilience." The applause that followed wasn't just for her words, but for the authenticity behind them, the evident journey from rigidity to wisdom, from certainty to nuanced understanding. Later, as we shared a quiet dinner at her condo, she surprised me with an unexpected revelation. "I found something during the move from Portland," she said, retrieving a small box from a shelf. "I wasn't sure whether to show you, but after your Ridgefield trip, it seems right." Inside the box was a collection of newspaper clippings, printed website articles, and photographs, a chronicle of my early career that I had never known existed. "Your father started collecting these about a year after you left," she explained. At first secretly, I found him clipping an article about your first major client from a business journal. Later, more openly, he called it his Mackenzie file. I flipped through the materials, somewhat stunned by the evidence of attention I had never suspected. Coverage of Narrative Pulse's early projects, a photograph of me accepting a Regional Innovation Award, printouts of the company's first website iterations. He followed every development, my mother continued, not just the major milestones that made headlines, but the smaller steps. He had Google alerts set up for your name, for the company. The revelation shifted something in my understanding of those silent years. I had imagined my parents simply moving on, dismissing my choice as youthful rebellion they expected to fail. The evidence of consistent attention, of ongoing awareness despite the lack of direct contact, complicated that narrative. Why didn't you reach out sooner? I asked, the question I had never directly posed during our years of reconciliation. Fear, she admitted simply. Fear you would reject us, as we had rejected you. Fear of facing the harm we had caused. Fear of having to acknowledge that everything we had built our lives around, our certainties about right paths and proper choices, had been proven wrong by your success. The honesty of the answer, the acknowledgement of how ego and identity had been entangled with their parenting choices, was more valuable than any apology could have been. And when you finally did reach out, after the Business Insider article, your father's health scare was the catalyst, she confirmed. But the timing with the article wasn't coincidental. We had been working up courage for months, drafting messages, deleting them, arguing about approach. The article gave us an opening, a reason to contact you that seemed legitimate, that acknowledged your success without having to directly confront our failure. I nodded, understanding the complex psychology. You needed a bridge. We did, she agreed, though we didn't deserve one. I considered this, turning over a photograph of myself accepting an award I hadn't known my father had tracked. Maybe it's not about deserving. Maybe it's about what becomes possible when bridges exist, regardless of who built them or why. She smiled slightly, recognizing her own words from a recent mentorship session reflected back to her. Wisdom from the Diana Rivera Initiative? The same, I confirmed. Some smart woman said that last week. We shared a moment of genuine connection, not erasing the painful history, but acknowledging how far we had traveled from it. How the relationship we had now, while bearing scars from its fracturing, had been rebuilt with greater awareness, more honesty, clearer boundaries. Later that evening, after returning to my own home, I reflected on the journey from that desperate teenager in a Honda Civic to the woman I had become. The standard narrative, that success was the best revenge against those who had rejected, you felt increasingly hollow. My parents' recognition of my bank account hadn't been the meaningful victory. The deeper triumph was in building a life authentic to my values, in creating opportunity for others facing similar challenges, in finding capacity for compassion without erasing accountability. The phrase from my father's tombstone, "The journey continues," seemed suddenly more profound. Not just acknowledgement that spiritual existence might extend beyond physical death, but recognition that no story truly ends where we expect. That reconciliation doesn't erase harm, but creates new narrative possibilities. That second doors sometimes lead back to transformed versions of what we thought we had left behind forever. The Legacy Revitalization Initiative continued expanding, with Jade's Candle Shop, now thriving under Jordan's innovative leadership, serving as its flagship success story. The Diana Rivera Mentorship Initiative developed specialized programming for parents of LGBTQ+ youth, first-generation college, students, and young entrepreneurs facing family resistance. Narrative Pulse evolved beyond traditional marketing into immersive storytelling using emerging technologies. Through it all, my mother and I continued building our complex relationship, neither pretending the past hadn't happened, nor allowing it to define our future. We worked together 3 days a week at the foundation, shared Sunday dinners, maintained healthy boundaries, and acknowledged both the harm done and the healing found. On the 15th anniversary of being kicked out, a date that had evolved from painful memory to complex milestone, I found myself reviewing applications for the next cohort of scholarship recipients. One essay particularly caught my attention, written by a young woman whose parents had disowned her for pursuing dance instead of medicine. "When they changed the locks," she wrote, "they thought they were closing a door. They didn't realize they were forcing me to build my own, one that would open onto a larger landscape than any they had imagined for me." The echo of my own experience in her words was striking. I approved her application immediately, then sent the quote to my mother with a simple note. "The next generation of second door builders. The journey continues." Her response came quickly. "And we'll make sure she doesn't have to build it entirely alone." That, perhaps, was the most meaningful outcome of our complicated family story. Not just my individual success or our personal reconciliation, but the structures created to ensure others facing similar rejection would find the support I had initially lacked. The networks, resources, and communities established to transform individual hardship into collective resilience. My parents had missed me after seeing my bank account, yes. But the real value wasn't in their recognition of my financial worth. It was in the journey we had all taken from rejection to reconciliation, from rigid expectations to authentic acceptance, from closed doors to new ones built with greater awareness and compassion. In the end, being locked out had forced me to build something stronger than what I had lost. Not just a successful company or substantial net worth, but a life defined by my own values and dedicated to creating more humane paths for those who would follow. And that was a success no bank account could measure. 20 years after that life-altering December night, I found myself standing on a stage at a global entrepreneurship summit, addressing an audience of thousands. The journey from homeless teenager to keynote speaker had been neither linear nor predictable, filled with unexpected turns, painful growth, and hard-won wisdom. Narrative Pulse had evolved into something I could never have envisioned during those desperate early days. Not just a marketing agency, but a global communications ecosystem employing over 500 people across 3 continents. As I surveyed the audience, young entrepreneurs hungry for inspiration, established business leaders seeking fresh perspectives, educators and mentors guiding the next generation, I recognized what this moment represented. Not merely personal achievement, but the responsibility of legacy. What would I leave behind beyond balance sheets and brand strategies? What meaning could be extracted from my particular path that might serve others facing their own locked doors? The conventional narrative about success after rejection follows a predictable arc, I began, departing from my prepared remarks. The moment of dismissal, the struggle in obscurity, the triumphant return where former doubters must acknowledge what they failed to recognize. It's a satisfying story. It's the one that fits neatly into viral headlines and inspirational memes. I paused, making eye contact with audience members in different sections. But that narrative, while emotionally satisfying, misses the more complex truth. The most valuable outcome isn't proving doubters wrong. It isn't even the success itself. It's the person you become through the process of building something on your own terms. The Diana Rivera Mentorship Initiative had recently celebrated its 5th anniversary, having supported over 300 families navigating the complicated terrain between parental expectations and children's autonomous choices. My mother, now 75, had developed a curriculum based on her own journey from rigid certainty to nuanced understanding. Though increasingly limited by arthritis that made travel difficult, she continued mentoring online, her quiet wisdom resonating with parents struggling to reconcile traditional values with unconventional paths. When I was 17, I continued, My parents changed the locks on our family home because I chose digital marketing over the educational path they had designated. That night, sleeping in my car, I couldn't have imagined standing here too. Decades later, I certainly couldn't have predicted that my mother would eventually lead a program helping parents avoid making the same devastating mistake. A ripple of reaction moved through the audience: surprise, recognition, connection to their own complex family dynamics. The headline version of my story suggests that my parents only valued me once they saw my bank account. It's a satisfying oversimplification that positions success as the ultimate vindication. But the reality contains more nuance, more humanity, and ultimately more hope. I hadn't planned to speak so personally, especially about my family. These aspects of my journey typically remained private, shared only within the Foundation's work where vulnerability served a specific purpose. But something about this moment, perhaps the 20-year milestone, perhaps the global reach of this particular platform, called for deeper authenticity. My parents did reach out after seeing evidence of my financial success, I acknowledged. But our genuine reconciliation came later, through the painful, unglamorous work of confronting harm, acknowledging failure, and building something new amid the ruins of what had been destroyed. It came through my father's stroke forcing vulnerability he would never have chosen, through my mother finding purpose in helping others avoid her mistakes, through all of us recognizing that wounded relationships can heal, but they will always bear scars. As I continued sharing the fuller, more complex narrative, not just of individual triumph, but of collective growth, not just of vindication, but of transformation, I noticed a figure entering at the back of the auditorium. Even at a distance, I recognized my mother's distinctive posture, the careful way she navigated using her cane. She hadn't mentioned traveling to this event, knowing my schedule was already compressed. The most valuable lesson from my journey isn't that success is the best revenge, I concluded. It's that even our most painful rejections can become foundations for something meaningful, not just for ourselves, but for those who will face similar obstacles. The doors that lock behind us force creation of new ones that others might pass through more easily. The standing ovation that followed wasn't just for me, but for the story itself. The messy, complicated, ultimately hopeful narrative of harm, healing, and purposeful rebuilding that resonated beyond specific details. As the audience rose to their feet, I made my way off stage and through side corridors to find my mother. She was waiting in the green room, looking tired but determined, her silver hair swept into the elegant chignon she had maintained since my childhood. "You came," I said, embracing her carefully, mindful of her increasing fragility. "I wanted to surprise you," she replied. 20 years felt significant. 20 years since that night. The recognition of the anniversary hung between us, acknowledged, without need for elaboration. We had both been tracking the milestone privately, each with our own complex emotions about this particular measure of time. "Your speech," she began, then hesitated. "I wondered if you would mention us." "Not by name," I assured her. "But yes, our journey felt relevant to the larger point." She nodded, understanding. It should be shared, not despite the messy parts, but because of them. After the summit concluded, we shared a quiet dinner at my hotel, the kind of comfortable togetherness that had developed over years of careful rebuilding. My mother, once so concerned with appearances and proper choices, had evolved into someone more reflective, more willing to question fundamental assumptions. "I've been thinking about legacy," she said as we lingered over dessert. "What we leave behind, that matters." "The initiative," I suggested. "The families you've helped." "More than that." She hesitated, choosing words carefully. "I've been working with a writer, documenting the journey from both perspectives, yours and mine, the locked door and what came after." The revelation surprised me. My mother had always been private about our family history, sharing only within the controlled context of the mentorship program. You're writing a book? A resource, she clarified, for families facing similar crossroads. Not just inspirational platitudes, but practical guidance, navigated through our mistakes and eventual reconnection. The project made sense given her commitment to helping others avoid our painful path, but still represented a significant step in vulnerability. Would you be willing to contribute? She asked. Your perspective alongside mine? The complete circle. Of course, I agreed immediately. It's time our full story was available to those who need it. As we discussed the project, I recognized what this represented. Not just documentation of our particular journey, but creation of meaning from what had once been only pain. The locked door becoming a threshold to unexpected purpose. The following. Morning. Before my flight home, I accompanied my mother to her hotel's rooftop garden. She had always found peace in green spaces, even as mobility limitations increasingly confined her to urban environments. We sat among potted trees and flowering shrubs, watching the city awaken below. I've made arrangements, she said after a comfortable silence, for when I'm gone. The statement, delivered without preamble, caught me off guard. Though 75, my mother remained sharp and relatively healthy, despite arthritis and the normal slowing of age. That's pragmatic, I replied carefully, but hopefully premature. She smiled slightly. Not imminent, just inevitable. I want you to know my wishes now, while we can discuss them openly. I nodded, giving her space to continue. The condo goes to the foundation, of course, for housing scholarship recipients or emergency accommodations. She paused. And I've established a trust to maintain the mentorship initiative indefinitely. These practical arrangements seemed in character. My mother had always been organized, forward-thinking about logistics. But there's something else, she continued. A request, not an obligation. Anything, I assured her. When it happens, she said, looking out over the city rather than at me, I'd like to be memorialized alongside your father. The request revealed vulnerability she rarely displayed. My father had been buried in the family plot in Ridgefield, a location my mother had visited only occasionally since his death. Our lives had been firmly centered in Seattle for many years. Now, you want to be buried in Connecticut? I clarified, surprised given her apparent disconnection from her former home. No, she shook her head. I want my ashes divided, half with him, acknowledging the life we shared despite its flaws, half scattered somewhere meaningful to you and me, something just ours. The request illuminated something profound about how she viewed our family story, not as separate chapters of before and after estrangement, but as a continuous narrative with its own integrity despite the fractures within it. That feels right, I agreed. Honoring the full arc. She nodded, satisfied. The older I get, the more I see our story as one piece, not divided by that night. Before, during, after. All part of who we became. It was a perspective that resonated with my own evolution. The night the locks changed had been pivotal, traumatic, transformative, but it existed within a longer narrative that included both the nurturing of early childhood and the complicated healing of adult reconnection. 6 months later, the book project had evolved into something more expansive than initially conceived. Rather than simply a resource for parents and children navigating expectation conflicts, it had developed into an exploration of broader themes: identity, formation, autonomy versus belonging, the nature of forgiveness, the possibility of meaningful repair after profound rupture. My mother and I were scheduled for a joint radio interview about the project, an opportunity to model the dual perspective approach that made the book distinctive. I arrived at her condo to drive her to the studio, only to find her still in her bathrobe, clearly unwell. Just tired, she insisted when I expressed concern. Up with pain most of the night. We can reschedule, I offered, but she shook her head. I've taken something for it. I'll manage. During the interview, she was characteristically articulate about her journey from rigid certainty to nuanced understanding, from enforcing a singular vision of success to recognizing diverse valid paths. But I noticed her hands trembling, a sheen of perspiration despite the cool studio, slight hesitations before more complex responses. When we returned to her condo, I insisted on calling her doctor. The diagnosis came swiftly, not just arthritis flare-up, but a serious infection, requiring hospitalization. Within hours, she was in intensive care, her system struggling to fight what had already spread throughout her body. Sepsis, the doctor explained. We're administering antibiotics, but her age complicates treatment. I stayed at the hospital. Through the night, watching as medical professionals worked to stabilize her condition. By morning, she had regained consciousness, though remained weak and disoriented. "The book," she said when she recognized me, her voice barely audible. "Finish it." "We will," I assured her. "Together when you're stronger." She shook her head slightly, the movement clearly requiring effort. "You know enough. My perspective. Carry it forward." The implication was clear. She was preparing me for the possibility she wouldn't recover. I refused to accept the finality, focusing instead on practical support, on advocating with medical staff, on maintaining hope without denying reality. For 3 days, her condition fluctuated, improving slightly, then deteriorating, stabilizing, then presenting new complications. I practically lived at the hospital, working remotely when necessary, sleeping in the uncomfortable recliner beside her bed. On the 4th night, during a period of unexpected clarity, she beckoned me closer. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice stronger than it had been since admission, "about the night we changed the locks." I took her hand, surprised by this turn toward our most painful history. "We don't need to revisit that now." "I do," she insisted. One thing I never properly articulated. Not in all our conversations, not in the mentorship programs, not in the book drafts. I waited, giving her space to find the words she needed. "When your father suggested changing the locks," she continued, "I agreed not just from weakness or confusion about proper parenting. Part of me, a part I didn't admit to anyone, even myself, was angry that you had the courage I never found." The admission, delivered with painful honesty, illuminated dimensions of that night I had never considered. "Courage?" I echoed. "To choose your own path," she clarified. "To trust your vision despite opposition." I had surrendered my dreams decades earlier. Art school applications hidden from my own parents, acceptance letters never acted upon because practical careers were the only acceptable option. This revelation, that my mother had once harbored creative ambitions beyond the traditional path she had followed, added unexpected context to our conflict. She had enforced the very limitations she had accepted for herself, perhaps unconsciously, resenting my determination to break free where she had capitulated. "The Diana Rivera who mentors parents now," she continued, "who found meaning in helping others avoid her mistakes. She couldn't have existed without your courage first, without you showing what was possible." The acknowledgement that my rebellion had ultimately catalyzed her own belated liberation from limiting beliefs felt like closing a circle I hadn't known remained open. "We saved each other," I suggested, "just at different times." She smiled slightly, squeezing my hand with surprising strength. "The story makes more sense that way, doesn't it?" That night, her condition seemed to stabilize, offering cautious hope for recovery. By morning, however, a new crisis emerged. Her heart, weakened by the infection and years of subtle damage, began failing. Despite medical intervention, her system simply couldn't maintain the necessary fight. She slipped away peacefully just after dawn, my hand in hers, her final conscious moments spent ensuring I understood the fullness of our shared journey, not just the harmony at its conclusion, but the complex interweaving of harm and healing of failure and redemption, of mutual transformation that had brought us to genuine connection. In accordance with her wishes, her memorial service was intimate rather than elaborate, focused on the impact of her work rather than conventional expressions of loss. The Diana Rivera Mentorship Initiative participants past and present attended, each sharing how her guidance had transformed family relationships that had seemed beyond repair. She taught us that perfect understanding isn't required for meaningful connection, one father explained, that we could love our children authentically, even when their choices confused us. She never pretended to have been a perfect parent, a mother added. Her honesty about her failures made her wisdom about healing more credible. These testimonials, evidence that my mother had transformed her greatest regret into meaningful service to others, provided comfort amid grief. The woman being memorialized had evolved so far beyond the person who had stood silent as locks changed, beyond even the cautiously reconnecting mother of our early reconciliation. She had become someone defined not by her worst moment, but by how she had grown beyond it. Following her instructions, I divided her ashes as requested. Half were interred beside my father in the Ridgefield Cemetery, acknowledging the complex relationship that had shaped both their lives despite its imperfections. The other half I kept temporarily, considering the appropriate location for what she had described as something meaningful to you and me, something just ours. The answer came unexpectedly during final edits of the book we had been creating together. Among her files, I discovered notes about potentially expanding the Legacy Revitalization Initiative to include Ridgefield, specifically targeting businesses in the downtown area where she had frequented as a young mother, taking me for ice, cream after doctor appointments, or new shoes before school started. The realization of what would be most fitting struck immediately. The place that represented our relationship before fracture, the location of ordinary maternal care rather than extraordinary conflict. Not the house where locks had changed, but the community spaces where everyday nurturing had occurred. 3 months later, on what would have been her 76th birthday, I returned to Ridgefield with the remaining ashes. The town had continued, evolving in the years since my pilgrimage. More upscale shops, fewer local businesses, the inevitable progression of economic change. But the Central Park remained largely as I remembered. The gazebo still standing where my mother had once read stories during summer library programs. I scattered her ashes discreetly among the flowering shrubs surrounding that gazebo, connecting her final resting place not to the night of rejection, but to earlier moments of genuine maternal presence. As I completed this ritual, a young mother settled on a nearby bench, opening a picture book for the toddler beside her. The ordinary scene of intergenerational connection felt like affirmation of my choice, linking my mother not to our worst moment, but to the everyday tenderness that had also been real. That evening, I met with the town's economic development director, a woman approximately my age who had reviewed my proposal with evident enthusiasm. The Legacy Revitalization Initiative could make a significant difference here, she acknowledged, gesturing toward the increasingly empty storefronts along Main Street. Local businesses have struggled competing with nearby shopping centers and online retail. My mother grew up shopping at Ridgefield Pharmacy, Moretti's Hardware, Reed's Bookshop, I explained. Those relationships formed her understanding of community. I'd like to honor that by helping the next generation of local entrepreneurs succeed. The meeting resulted in a framework for extending the initiative eastward, starting with businesses in downtown Ridgefield, but eventually encompassing similar struggling New England communities. The Diana Rivera Memorial Fund would provide both capital and mentorship, ensuring that family-owned businesses could modernize without losing their essential character. As I drove away from Ridgefield that final time, I reflected on the complete arc of my relationship with the town that had once been home. The place I had fled in desperation had become the site of both personal closure and forward-looking investment. The community that had witnessed my rejection would now benefit from the expertise and resources developed through that very rejection's aftermath. The book my mother and I had created together, The Second Door, Rebuilding Family After Fundamental Rupture, was published 6 months after her death. Its dual perspective approach, alternating between my experience of being rejected and her evolution from enforcing rigid expectations to embracing complexity, resonated beyond our anticipated audience. Reading groups, family therapy programs, and even corporate leadership trainings adopted it as a framework for understanding change, growth, and reconciliation. During the book's launch event, hosted at Foundation headquarters, Jordan Taylor, now the successful owner of not just Jade's Candle Shop, but 3 additional locations, approached with an unexpected proposal. "We've been thinking about how to honor the 5th anniversary of the Legacy Revitalization Initiative," she explained. "What if we created a retreat center for families working through similar transitions to yours? A neutral space for difficult conversations, professional mediation, temporary accommodations when home situations become untenable?" The concept aligned perfectly with both my mother's legacy and my own evolving vision for the Foundation's work. Not just financial support or educational resources, but physical space for the messy, painful, necessary process of authentic reconciliation. "The Second Door Center," I suggested, "for families finding new ways forward." "Exactly," Jordan nodded. Something concrete to complement the book's wisdom. The center opened 18 months later, a renovated mountain lodge 2 hours from Seattle. Its design incorporated both private spaces for difficult conversations and communal areas for shared activities, recognition that reconciliation requires both honest confrontation and positive connection. Professional mediators, family therapists, and former mentorship initiative participants staffed the facility, offering guidance without prescribing specific outcomes. On the center's opening day, standing beside the memorial garden dedicated to both my parents and to Jade Wilson, I reflected on the unlikeliness of this particular legacy. How the frightened teenager sleeping in her car could never have imagined that the very rupture causing such pain would eventually create sanctuary for others facing similar crises. How rejection had ultimately generated not just personal success, but systemic support for more humane family transitions. The viral headline that had once oversimplified my story, "My parents kicked me out as a teen, now they miss me after seeing my bank account," captured only the shallowest dimension of what had proven a much deeper journey. Yes, my parents had initially reached out after evidence of financial success, but the genuine reconnection, the meaningful healing, the legacy now continuing beyond all our lifetimes, that had come through the harder, slower work of authentic transformation. 25 years after being locked out of my childhood home, I had built not just successful businesses and substantial wealth, but a framework for understanding how rejection could become foundation rather than merely obstacle. How wounded relationships could heal not into perfect replicas of what was lost, but into something new that honored both the pain of rupture and the possibility of growth. The Second Door Center would welcome its first families the following week, parents struggling to understand children's unconventional choices, young people feeling unrecognized in their authentic identities, families negotiating the complex terrain between autonomy and belonging. Some would find paths to meaningful reconciliation. Others would establish healthier boundaries without full reunion. All would discover resources unavailable to that 17-year-old girl in her Honda Civic, navigating rejection without map or community. That evening, after the opening ceremonies concluded, I walked alone through the center's grounds, pausing. At the simple stone marker in the garden, Diana and Richard Rivera, Jade Wilson Complex Journeys, Meaningful Growth. The path continues. The inscription acknowledged both the wounds inflicted and the healing found, both the failures experienced and the wisdom eventually gained. It recognized that our most painful chapters need not define, us permanently. That transformation remains possible even after profound rupture. That second doors can lead to unexpected destinations more valuable than what was initially lost. 25 years after being kicked out, my bank account was indeed substantial. But the true measure of success wasn't financial validation from those who had rejected me. It was the creation of meaning from what had once been only pain, the transformation of personal trauma into collective resource, the building of sanctuaries, where others might navigate similar terrain with greater support. The locked door had ultimately opened onto a landscape I could never have imagined that desperate December night. Not just personal triumph or individual reconciliation, but a legacy of compassion extending far beyond my particular story. A second door leading not backward to what was lost, but forward into something more valuable than what had been taken away. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.